So as you're looking at this overview screen, I hope each of you are thinking in the back of your mind about your own relationships and thinking about those inherent dialectics, those pushes and pulls that we could all give examples of, stability and change, closeness and openness. You realize that what we're going to focus in on now are really the game changers, and that is insights to ways that we respond to dialectics that can be ethical, unethical, constructive, not so constructive. So specifically, what do I mean when I say how do we respond to or manage dialectics? Well, I use the term framing or reframing. And so you remember the metaphor, a metaphor that explains how we respond to tensions, that we respond in a variety of ways, and that ultimately how we respond determines the meaning we create. Just like the image of looking out the window. If I frame it where I only see the tree, there's a completely different meaning than when I frame it and I can see only sidewalk or asphalt. So we're going to look at 6 framing practices, and I trust as we walk through these, you can see the radical difference they make and the empowering that happens when we begin to think about our own relationships and how we're responding to these inevitable pushes and pulls. One way we respond is through selection, selecting one end of the tension. So if open and closed is the tension, I might say something like, well, let's never talk about that again, and refuse for a topic to come up. Well, you can see where there might be value in that. There may be some things that need to stay taboo. You can also see how Bakhtin and others would recognize the problematic nature of letting that happen often or too often. Because if topics begin to be taboo, it may be in a free civil society we begin to not involve in civil discourse over important differences that we have. Or in a family situation, those secrets could actually kill us. And yet selecting is part of what we ultimately do when we respond. Think about your own examples, and let's move to a second way we respond to dialectics. Alternating between tension poles. So if you look at these examples, you can see where individuals are saying things like, hey, can we just talk about this, but just once every few weeks, or let's save this discussion for some other time or some other place when I'm alone or rested. So as opposed to selecting and only focusing in on being open or just being closed, the idea here is changing whether you're open or closed based on time or place. A third way we frame or reframe is called segmentation. And if you think of a segment in a line, you can think of it in terms of different compartments and how different aspects of the relationship, it may be our language betrays the idea that I'm framing in terms of what's appropriate for a given relationship. In this example, I think about a father-son, where certain things might be talked about, but not those same topics might not be talked about if my son also happens to be a player on my team. Well, 3 of the ways then, as we've discussed, selecting, alternating, and segmentation, there's still 3 others that are really critical to understand. One of those is complementary, and that is finding ways to attend to both poles at the same time. And you can imagine a couple with regard to being together or connecting and having alone time or autonomy might say things like, well, can't we just be together, but we're just going to read? And they may actually be on the couch reading, but reading different books. So there's togetherness, but there's also separateness. There's autonomy, but there's also connection. 5th, and perhaps the most problematic nature one, is reframing as a paradox or a double bind. And resulting from that, a kind of ignoring, a withdrawing in order to cope. So a person might say, there's no way I can talk about this, no way we can have more time together, no way. And that is a kind of selection, sounds familiar, but what's going on, and the researchers that have looked at this in organizational context recognize there may be a situation where a person feels like if in the context of openness or closed, if I'm open, it's going to cause problems. If I'm closed, it's going to cause problems. So the person actually withdraws from the relationship and withdraws from the topic altogether and ignores it. Well, that obviously can become a very dysfunctional and even unhealthy practice in a relationship, yet it's part of our human experience at times. Finally, number 6 is the idea of transformation, where we might find ways to manage a dialectic by finding ways to transcend the dialectic, so it's not even experienced as one. So if you think of autonomy and connection, it might be being together can happen even when we're not together. In other words, a couple no longer thinks in terms of and puts up a picture frame that includes the tension, the dialectic, as in opposition to one another, but rather sees togetherness or autonomy and connection is something that they're going to experience on and off through the day, on and off when they're physically together, and on and off when maybe they're only spiritually together. So transformation is more of that kind of mysterious experience in our relationships when we realize that we do not, in this example, have to be together to be together. So finally then, those 6 major ways of framing are going to be the focus of your paper. And the idea would be for you to pick out a particular dialectic and then reflect on which of these ways have you been framing it. But I want to spend some time as we move away from these major kinds of framing responses that your paper is going to focus on: selection, alternation, segmentation, double bind, collaboration, and transformation. I want to move to a local Arkansas story. A few of you in the class are aware of, either because you've been in my class or you've talked to me. It has everything to do with ethics and then research that I've been involved in our own backyard. It's a Central Arkansas story, and ultimately a story that's full of hope and action. So let me talk to you about one of the more exciting things I've been involved in over the last decade. And the context I want to begin with is to provide you with some background on this particular case analysis I did. And the background is going to take on a couple of parts, but it has to do with churches in Central Arkansas. And one of the things that I wasn't aware of, but some of you may be aware of, is that when you look nationally at the significance of churches, that 50% of social capital, and we're thinking primarily churches, but certainly it includes all religious organizations, are found in those organizations. Now, what do I mean by social capital? Putnam and work that he's done that has led to a group called the Seguro Seminar. This particular group has actually measured in cities and different communities how connected they are, how much time people are spending in relationships, how much time do they spend collaborating. And religious organizations, it turns out, do a lot of that connecting. That connecting results in social support, results in services and volunteering in the community. So social capital is found to be an important part of life and health in organizations, in communities, to the point that if social capital is high, teen pregnancy is lower. If social capital is higher, all kinds of other social ills are reduced, not just teen pregnancy, but also incarceration rates and drug addiction rates. You can move on down the line. So when we talk about revitalized social networks, other research done by Warren in 2004 would look at how those revitalized social networks, that increased social capital, also empowers people politically. So an important context to look at, and yet the norm, as many of you are aware of, has been in the U.S. a history of division with non-cooperation. If we were to think of a dialectic between cooperation and non-cooperation, non-cooperation has been the norm. 400 different denominations broken into 19 different families, and therefore a history that's also not only divided over the last few hundred years, traditions divide, and historically, ethnically, about 90% of the churches in our country are still only about 10% integrated. And so with that background, I became curious about a movement that began well over a decade ago. And I want to first talk about the impact that this movement had. A movement called the Nehemiah Network that began in about 1998, 1999. Over the last decade plus, the kind of network they created resulted in a collaborative support network for a group called The Call, Children of Arkansas Love for a Lifetime. And this particular group has meant a partnership with DHS serving kids in our community and has meant more foster families available. There have also been thousands, literally thousands, you can see here 3,000 to 4,000 volunteers that have turned out in activities called CityFest or ShareFest, where churches agreed to turn outward to do more in their community than they had in the past. Then also over $1 million in nonprofit has been donated to strategic nonprofits, and most of that going to inner city nonprofits, because part of the research of the Nehemiah Network recognized that a major gap and major problems happening in our inner city, in some cases because churches had pulled away from serving. And so some of the earlier work I did with a colleague of mine now at Abilene Christian University, John Camp, looked at the way this organization had worked and their impact on their community and their efforts to more closely identify with the community. But specifically, and more recently, with Dr. Maryville and another colleague of mine, Dr. Meyer, began to analyze this organization in terms of their dialectics, unity versus diversity, cooperation versus non-cooperation. And what we found is that what made this organization so effective is that they recognized that they did not need to withdraw from one another and select just non-cooperation because of theological differences and historic ethnic differences, that they could learn to alternate based on purpose, that those individuals involved in having the impact on the community recognized that coming together to serve was powerful, and that service could transcend those differences. Also, transformation, as we talked about, where in times of common prayer, this group still involved in annual retreats and in monthly times together in prayer, help them to see cooperation and non-cooperation as something they didn't even experience as a tension any longer. So the power of relational dialectic theory is one that should prompt you to think about positive applications. And I want you to make sure in your paper, just like the others, you move from theory to a concept, one of those 6 framing practices, to an analysis of a situation where you framed one way or the other. It can be workplace, it can be family, it can be friends. And then think about, well, what's an insight? It may be you frame things in a very positive, constructive way, and so your positive practice reflects that. It may be you've recognized the need to frame something differently. So look forward to the positive applications you create, and then I want to introduce you to a few of my own when we're together again. I look forward to that discussion, and I appreciate your patience as I deal with some of my pain.